So, wow, that was really great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Nana. And I'm especially excited to be here as a part of the How Do You Say Yam in African Global Artist Collective. I feel a little bit kind of plucked out of, I've been just like at the beach, you know, for the past 2 months. And I've been learning how to become a bicycle mechanic, like really intensively. So I'm just like, what the fuck? Now I'm here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, so the title is of my talk is promising, I think, but I will not, promising in the sense that it promises a lot, but it will not fulfill all that it promises because that's from a much longer talk. So I'm going to just read, and it's broken up into 4 parts, and so I'm just going to do the first 2 short lectures, which are, we'll focus on Dred Scott, the artist, and Claudia Rankine, the poet. But I will read you the small abstract so that you get a sense of the context for the larger piece. And it's a speculative lecture, you know, because I teach in an MFA program, like I can be like speculative and I don't have to like, you know, prove shit. I can just say things that I think. So the larger piece is a speculative lecture in 4 acts, and it investigates the relationship between race and innovative poetics or aesthetics. What it asks, can a poetics that values, enacts, fracture, fissure, and a complication of the lyric eye contribute to contemporary understanding of the experiences of raced bodies in the social sphere? Using artist Kara Walker's controversial works, that's not going to happen today, Claudia Rankine's hybrid writings, Imner Bessie Phillips' Zong, Dred Scott's work. This talk problematizes the assumed neutrality of whiteness and foregrounds the potential power of fractured subjectivities. What does it mean to know ourselves? Is there a way to take the remains of a fractured subjectivity, a post-traumatic body, black bodies unjustly beaten or killed by police, other disposable bodies, and build forward toward an imagined future? Lecture 1, Dred Scott. In this, a speculative frame, some questions to which I do not know the answers. Also, a word on the cognitive methodology at work in these lectures. Some beginnings, unsupported assumptions, meanderings, walks toward ghosts, cognitive dissonance, accidental associations, dislocations, and rages. The questions that swirl into and are productive of anything resembling speculation are ones that press upon my imagination, a writer, an artist, and a citizen, not merely of the United States, but necessarily of the world, within a category called human. And human in this case is a sensibility. Instead of who belongs within its imagined borders, instead of who watches whom or studies whom or analyzes whom, a sensibility of empathy or of crossing space. I mean, inhabiting the space between the self and another. I am thinking of philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's ideas on the relation between perception, what can be seen and what cannot be seen, abstractions within the realms of language and truth. Notice the inextricability and reversibility between touching and being touched that Merleau-Ponty imagines when he writes in The Visible and the Invisible. This is a quote from that book. When my hand touches my left hand while it is palpating the things where the touching subject passes over to the rank of the touched, descends into the things, such that the touched is formed in the midst of the world and as it were in the things. I admire Merleau-Ponty very much, and I've long enjoyed thinking about how he extends the relation between touching and being touched to the realm of the visible, what it means to be what it means to see something or someone, and the ability to be seen, to be made visible. There's something of the idyllic in his analysis, and underneath it, for me, a wet weeping and that recognition that in the relation between humans, one must first, within the invention that is in the Western world, be recognized as human. I wonder if there is an Afro-future in which the category of human is rewritten as sensibility, which implies a kind of extreme sensation of empathy, more sustained but akin to the feeling that many of us have when we, for that fleeting second, feel like we know what it is to be another being. Do you know that feeling, that weird sensation where you're just like, oh, I felt like, that's what that person feels like inside, and then it just goes away? What is required when imagining the future is perhaps a radical, directed forgetting. So these first slides that I'm going to show, the first one is familiar to many. It's of the two slides. The first two slides will be the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. And it was referenced earlier, the I am a man slogan by Nana. So that's one of those. And then here's the other one. And then a familiar reimagining of that slogan in Ferguson, Missouri from last year, those protests. And then these are all from the Dred Scott, the conceptual and performance artist Dred Scott's 1 hour performance piece, I Am Not a Man, from 2009. And they're in a kind of random order because I was rushing to put them together, so it's not as if they happen in this order. Okay. So this is what the artist Dred Scott says about his 1 hour performance piece, I Am Not a Man. I am, but I am not. I Am Not a Man was a performance that was presented on the streets of Harlem, New York. I walked bearing a historic but crucially altered protest sign that read, I am not a man. Throughout the walk, actions in the performance evoked the humiliation that is visited on black people and the negation that defines our existence. Making reference to the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers strike, where the iconic I Am a Man sign originated, the performance inverted the sign's statement, pointing to the importance of the civil rights protests as well as to their limitations. Along with this historic resonance, the performance simultaneously addressed our era. Racism is foundational to America and has not been abated. I Am Not a Man resides in the uncomfortable space between a race-free fantasy world and the lived experiences of millions. So I'm drawn to Dred Scott's performance, who actually I want to bring that last one back up. So I'm drawn to that performance, which, for those of you who don't know, he takes his name from the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, where the U.S. Supreme Court decided that African Americans, whether slave or free, could not be Americans and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. Dred Scott was an enslaved black man who had been taken to the free states by his owners. While there, he attempted to sue for his freedom. What intrigues me about the performance piece is its existence between the real and the fantasy, and the way the signification of those terms shift. The fantasy of the, quote, nigger in the, quote, woodpile popping up when you least expect it. The fantasy that in the linguistic claim, quote, man, allows the object to become, quote, human, instead of existing in that fray of black becoming subject. It's like the opposite of language that acts. I am not a man points toward how the black body can disrupt this relation between language and action, somehow rendering language moot. Sometimes, depending upon whose neck language hangs, it can be flaccid, unstructured. In I am not a man claiming the unclaimable, manhood, personhood, the object performs abjection, reduces the black body to object, reflecting that body's experience in the world. The claim in the performance that one is not a man stakes its ground by articulating both linguistically and in corporeal actions of self-debasement an American reality of lived experience, as if to say, you can claim manhood all you want. Yet, at the same time, one can clearly see a man, but really a gendered being, yes, standing before them in the garb of a man, suit, tie, hat. What excites me about the workings of language here is that the slippage between the language which acts, language that's gutted of meaning, and the language that plays opens up the possibility for an irreducibility that which cannot be read, contained, articulated, made object, or animal by the forces that want to reduce it to those categories. Visibility, says Foucault, when writing about the panoptic power, is a trap. What it means to be the object of potential gazes is indeed to be looked in, locked in, recognized. Recognizability for the black body, however, is like the object of Foucault's panoptic gaze, leaden with the responsibility of being the thing seen in claiming that which has been seen, already articulated, and known from before. Recognizability is critical to the maintaining of order. To be recognized as X is to manifest the impossibility of innovative resistance. It also makes possible the scaffolding for misrecognition. I am the eye who is the center of your eye, your apple eye. To be loosened from the restraints endemic to identity, to be untethered. The defining elements of the raced body reproduce themselves with seemingly no assistance from any force outside of it. It looks automatic, this function of power, but it's not. The poet Ed Robertson writes, quote, I knew I had to write in such a way that readers knew the poem carried its own definitions within it, its own grammar, its own dictionary, since the white dictionary had blacked out certain levels of words. He reminds us that language is created by social conditions and also that there is a possibility there for creating a new set of conditions that reflect or create a new reality. The way of Dred Scott's speaking, his sly articulation of the impossibility of one claim and the taking up of the experience of the black body and language has for me a startling effect of both laying one thing bare while simultaneously remaining itself unsettled. Its new grammar is one that refuses to foreclose meaning, which any good innovative art that attends to identity, particularly race, must do. So I'm going to end this by showing you just a little 3-minute excerpt of the installation piece, Stop, by Dred Scott. And I won't say anything about it, I'll just go on to talk about Claudia Rankine, but I do want you to see it.
I've been stopped 60 or more times. I've been stopped by the cops 150 times, probably a little bit more.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped 60 or more times.
I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped about 20 times.
Get stopped by the cops every day, but 150s, that about sums it up. Stopped about 60 times or more.
I've been stopped 70 times.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped a lot of
I've been
times,
stopped by the police
150.
30 times or more.
I've been stopped about
70
20 times.
60 times or more.
Searched more than
I've been stopped
100
by the
times.
police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped somewhere in the
70
hundreds,
times.
close to.
I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more. I've been stopped by the police 30 times or more.
I've been stopped 70 times.
I've been stopped 150 times.
I've been stopped and searched more than 100 times.
I've been stopped about 20 times.
Why do we value some bodies and why are other bodies disposable bodies? Why are the ways in which we all conspire to keep these, what are the ways in which we all conspire to keep these designations in place? How does remembering play a role in making us complicit in regulating the borders of these designations? When I mention disposable bodies, I am thinking of those bodies for which life itself is a thing unsecure. Do I have to make an argument for you that there is a difference, that some bodies are secure in the premise of life and others are not? I think I should. This is not overall about individual people as much as it is about groups of people. And I call them bodies often and not people because in the interaction in the social sphere, which is dictated by the relation between surfaces, not interiors, the color of the body, its gender, its size, its weight, its posture, its clothing, its gait is what renders the body recognizable. We bring to our encounter with the body whole sets of perceptions. From where do we get these perceptions? Where do we gather them that create and limit our encounter with another? People are killed every day. We humans are a murderous race. People are randomly pushed in front of trains and houses are broken into. Accidents occur and illness. Death abounds as much as it seems does life. Presence and then absence, here and then not here, as if presence never happened. In Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American Lyric, she takes notes of the kind of instability for certain bodies who are misrecognized as object. She also unveils a kind of disjunctive hermeneutics where interpretation of the object is misaligned with the thing itself. Let me bring this thought down to earth. Rankine writes about James Craig Anderson, a 49-year-old black man who was run over by an 18-year-old white teenager, then beaten to death by that teenager and his friends in Jackson, Mississippi in 2011. She writes about Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager who in 2012 was shot and killed by George Zimmerman, who was acquitted of any crime. Rankine testifies to the racially biased unfairness of, quote, random police stop and frisks when she writes, and you are not the guy, and still you fit the description of the guy because there is only one guy who is always the guy fitting the description. And since the present is what it is, I would be remiss not to mention explicitly Michael Brown, the unarmed teenager who was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, although Rankine's book was, of course, written and published before this more recent incident. What is at work when these bodies who are black and male come into view? What is seen on the surface of these bodies that entice the viewer to misread and to do so dangerously? What is this body anyway, if not black? And it is maleness. How does that manifest the perception of threat? Though to be sure, it is not only black boys and men who are perceived and treated as threat and then annihilated. 19-year-old Renisha McBride crashed her car in suburban Detroit and sought help at the doorstep of a white man who fatally shot her in the face. Indeed, it is blackness that is the real threat, perhaps. Gender only intensifies this perception. Death is only one result, the most tragic of disjunctive hermeneutics, as Rankine indicates when writing about her neighbor's misreading of a friend she and her husband had asked to take her child home from school. This is a quote from Rankine's book. Your neighbor tells you he is standing at his window watching a menacing black guy casing both your homes. The guy is walking back and forth talking to himself and seems disturbed. You tell your neighbor that your friend, whom he has met, is babysitting. He says no, it's not him. He's met your friend, and this isn't that nice young man. Anyway, he wants you to know he called the police. Your partner calls your friend and asks him if there is a guy walking back and forth in front of your home. Your friend says that if anyone were outside, he would see him because he is standing outside. You hear sirens through the speakerphone. Imagine a world, that's the end of the Rankine quote. Imagine a world, if you don't already live in that world, in which one of your jobs is to indicate to others that you are benign, that you don't want to kill them or rob them or rape them. I'm inclined to think of the black body as an inscribed body, one that has already been written. It is a body constructed by the discourses that produce it, disciplinary structures, apparatuses of the state, and via the gazes that access, create, and gesture in reaction to it. This body might not be a body at all, but instead a historical document or a document of historical production as a production of or from the weight of history. If the body, particularly for my purposes here, the gendered black body emerges via a series of historical representations that overdetermine its symbolic surface, then history in some ways destroys it. Paradoxically, the black gendered body is not allowed to exist, yet maintains a persistent, unyielding presence nurtured by historical presentations of it. The overdetermination is a kind of active remembering. Remembering, as we all know, however, is a flawed enterprise. Memory is not a literal reproduction of, this is a quote from Daniel Schechter, memory is not a literal reproduction of the past, but instead depends on constructive processes that are sometimes prone to errors, distortions, and illusions. And maybe, as I think about Jalal Tawfiq's claim that disaster annihilates tradition, maybe what's needed is another real disaster, to destroy a set of traditions and replace them with another. I wonder if innovative forms, if textual unconstruction, a kind of ruinous calamity, might be crucial to reimagining the complexities of race-gendered bodies now. In tradition, we often find reiteration and we cling to that. Also, nostalgia, once thought of as a disease from which we needed to be cured. My body here now presents itself to you a kind of offering. Not a mind on a stick, but a living thing that breathes, shits, bleeds, and clearly, according to cultural notions, is black and kind of female. There are its surfaces and its ways of being in the world, but what else? What are the interior spaces accessible or inaccessible to you? What are the ways I understand myself in relationship to you and not, if that is possible? If I chart my own legacy, it is one born from slaves and sharecroppers, Seminole Indians, and the whites who own the land, and the slaves and the sharecroppers. It is a legacy of poverty so devout it clings for generations later, imprisoning its devotees in its grasp and, of course, its actual jails. My cousin, who is a few years older than me, died of a heart attack after he'd been having one for a while. He didn't have access to health care. My other cousin, I speak of one, but there are several, spent some years incarcerated in jail for minor drug-related crimes. I imagine him and them distraught and nihilistic in their own poverty. No one is really keeping track. They live in Florida, a state where just today, at the writing of this lecture, a black man, for the first time, a first-time offender, is sentenced to what amounts to life in jail for some armed robberies he committed in which no one was hurt. Melissa Alexander, a black woman, has been sentenced to 20 years in jail for firing shots in the air to ward off her abusive husband who was threatening to kill her. It's almost inconceivable to imagine the latter sentence happening to a white woman whose husband is black. I'm going to pause here for a minute because I want to think about that. I want us all to just meditate on that fact for a second. So it looks like I have just 5 minutes. So I won't really get to talk too much about Citizen. But what I want to say about it. I think that I won't read from this. I think that the thing that I want to kind of convey in this part when we're talking about Citizen is there's something that I really want to imagine about a possibility for thinking about kind of what it means to be a kind of, that we all are in some ways fractured identities, that we claim a kind of wholeness and we claim a kind of individual self, and that, we're all attempting to kind of like live into that. But I think that there is something about the experience of being in the world and being in relationship to others that is already not that. And it is more not that for certain subjectivities, for certain bodies as they experience the world. And so is it possible to kind of reimagine a future in which that less coherent imagining of oneself becomes like a place of power? And I guess I'll end, since Fred Moten has been referenced several times. I'll end. He says something really powerful about that, actually. He says, and I'll just end with his words if I can find them, which I can't, of course. I just learned how to use these glasses, so I can barely see without them, which is why I can't find them. Anyway, so I'll end there with that possibility or that hope that we can do that. Thank you.
Are there questions for Dawn? Or shall we continue trying to envision the future where the non-coherentness becomes a place of power?
First of all, thank you very much, Dawn, for your talk. And well, you started, raising an opportunity of sort of speculation, which is, in your talk, and I think you ended on a note that I would like to sort of maybe talk a bit more on this future that you sketch out very briefly, sort of to shy away from the whole and to allow for sort of fracturedness, actually. I was wondering, like, how does the notion of fluidity come into that, sort of a malleability and sort of changeability of that kind of identity that you refer to? Just to pick your brain a bit more about what you were saying in the last section.
Okay. Now I have two. So, you know, here's what I think. I think that we are, you know, kind of like necessarily just like based on like the way in which culture is constructed, bound to continuity and to tradition and to the relationship between the past and the present. You know, that there is a kind of, you know, if we think of like any present, we can kind of, we feel and we experience traces of, you know, the violent past and a post-colonial present or whatever, right? And so, I mean, fluidity is not a term that I necessarily use, but like what I'm really interested in is some kind of reimagining of, like, is it possible to kind of live in a future now? And I think that like art has something to say about that, and I think that innovative language in you know, kind of experimental and conceptual art, especially as it's done by people of color, by queer folks, by trans folks, by who, you know, but it has has something really interesting to say in those realms that don't, you know, that aren't so invested in telling already told stories in ways that we seem to know, seem to recognize, through, and are also not interested. I really love when, like, people are not interested in reconceiving of themselves in ways that are already, quote, recognizable. So I'm interested in like those things and those kind of like spaces of that refuse to be kind of closed off or foreclosed. And I don't know what that has to, that's what you said made me think of, but I don't know what that has to do with fluidity, because it's not a term that I claim or use, really. So. Thanks.
There's one more question.
Thank you. I just want to know, does that mean that you've given up on the now?
On the now?
Yeah. Are you kind of fed up with it?
Now, like chair?
Yeah.
You know, I think that any kind of, there is already for me a space between the word and the thing. So I don't know, I haven't given up on the thing necessarily, I guess, that an object like that. But, you know, the noun for me is what, you know, that there's already something interrupting our experience of it. When we can claim it as kind of strongly and steadfastly as we want, especially, I guess, as it comes, if you're thinking about like human bodies, I guess, right? You know, like the black body. Like, what do we mean when we say the black body? You know, like, am I clinging to that adjectival noun? It just opens up like an encyclopedia of questions as opposed to it being like stable and something that, you know, I want to be recognizable. I wish it were less recognizable. I think that culture is one thing, community is another. Community culture created by those who create it. Still, you know, there's you know, it's always problematic. So have I given up on the noun? I mean, I trouble it. I like it. I like a lot of trouble, and I like the noun trouble.